Distinguished guests, good afternoon and a very warm welcome to the launch webinar of the Southeast Asia Climate Outlook 2022 Survey Report. I'm Jia Hui, your MC for today. In this webinar, we will be sharing and discussing key findings from the recently concluded Southeast Asia Climate Outlook Survey, which is carried out annually by the Climate Change in Southeast Asia program at ISEAS. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung for their generous support of this survey. Today, we have invited a panel of expert discussants who will be sharing their valuable insights on these results, and I look forward to hearing their views. Before we begin, please allow me to draw your attention to a few housekeeping matters. If you encounter any technical issues, please use the chat function to reach out to our technical support team. And to ask questions to the speakers, please use the Q&A function stating your name and affiliation together with your question. You can send in your questions at any time during the panel discussion. Thank you for your cooperation. Without further ado, I now have the pleasure of inviting Mr. Choi Shing Kwok, Director and Chief Executive Officer of ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute, to deliver his welcome remarks. Mr. Choi, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much. Well, Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon to all of you. On behalf of the ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute of Singapore, I warmly welcome you to the launch of the Southeast Asia Climate Outlook 2022 Survey Report. Let me start by thanking Mr. Stanley Loh, Permanent Secretary for the Ministry of Sustainability and the Environment of Singapore, for agreeing to give the opening remarks for this event, and also to all the panelists who will come later for participating in the discussion. As one of the most climate vulnerable regions in the world, Southeast Asia has already been facing the devastating impact of the climate crisis year after year. From the direct risks posed by extreme weather events to the downstream effects like heightened food security, the effects of this global crisis can be felt by all. Among ASEAN countries, Singapore has acknowledged and expressed a serious commitment to address this climate change challenge. Other countries in the region are also acutely aware of the threat of climate impacts and have signaled their intentions to respond to it. As part of this, the region is taking practical steps towards decarbonization, such as by setting climate targets and also by exploring low carbon development plans. 8 out of 10 ASEAN countries have now made net zero commitments, and at least 5 countries, that's Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and Vietnam, have implemented or will be implementing carbon pricing mechanisms. At the ASEAN level, countries are working together on pivotal projects such as the ASEAN Taxonomy of Sustainable Finance and the Laos, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore Power Integration Project, or LTMS-PIP. Both of these are very important first steps towards the much needed transition in our regional financial and energy ecosystems. While the regional momentum on climate change is growing, it must also be said that we still have a long way to go. According to the ASEAN Centre for Energy, coal continues to account for around 30% of planned power capacity additions this year. Meanwhile, the regional share of renewable energy is currently expected to reach only 13.6% by 2025, which means that ASEAN is not on track to reach its 2025 target of renewable energy share of 23%. So we are about 10% short. So this remains an aspirational target at best. With so many developments as well as challenges, to what extent are Southeast Asian citizens themselves aware of the region's progress and deficiencies in tackling climate change? What kind of changes do they wish to see in their own countries? How can their governments, their private sector, and also all other stakeholders respond to or tap into such ground sentiments? To help answer these questions, the Climate Change in Southeast Asia program in ISEAS has been conducting an annual public perception survey on various climate issues since 2020. The survey acts as a barometer of climate perceptions and attitudes in this region, focusing on several key topics such as energy, food security, climate governance, and international cooperation. While climate and environmental attitudes and beliefs are extensively studied in the global north, ISEAS survey is the first of its kind to pay attention to the public perceptions of climate issues from a global South and Southeast Asian specific context. And it has a special focus on the social, economic, and political dimensions of climate change. Not only does the survey confirm the sense of urgency felt by Southeast Asians from very diverse backgrounds, but it is also a valuable resource for those seeking to understand public awareness of various climate issues and how they are viewed by different stakeholders in each ASEAN country. I'm pleased to say that this is now the third year that ISEAS has conducted this survey. Previous survey reports have been extensively reported by the media around the region and around the world. The findings have also been cited in various reports as well as in education curricula. As such, we believe that these latest results to be launched today will both inform and empower all stakeholders involved in climate change, energy, food security, sustainable development, and international cooperation within as well as outside ASEAN. After the opening remarks by Mr. Stanley Loh, who will share with us some of Singapore's plans as well as their views, we will also be privileged to have a panel discussion of experts who will share their reactions to these latest survey results. I look forward to hearing the words in Stanley's address, as well as hearing the insights that will undoubtedly emerge from the discussion of the panelists later. So thank you very much, and I hand you back now to Jia Hui.
Thank you, Mr. Choi. I would now like to invite Mr. Stanley Loh, Permanent Secretary to the Ministry of Sustainability and the Environment, Singapore, to deliver his opening remarks. Sir, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Jia Hui. Mr. Choi Shing Kwok, CEO and Director of ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute. Dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. First of all, thank you to ISEAS for inviting me to join today's webinar and for organizing this important event. I would like to congratulate the ISEAS Climate Change in Southeast Asian Program for completing its third Southeast Asia Climate Outlook Survey report. I look forward to reading this report. Understanding is the key step to addressing any problem. This report provides a useful update on the attitudes and perceptions of the people in various Southeast Asian countries towards climate change. Last year's report found that the vast majority of respondents recognized the importance of climate change, with 7 in 10 viewing it as a serious and immediate threat. This sobering sentiment is justified, as demonstrated by recent weather developments and as predicted by science. Just last month, we saw in South Korea and Pakistan experiencing unprecedented rainfall and floods. About a third of Pakistan was completely underwater. Pakistan's Minister for Climate Change called the disaster apocalyptic. Meanwhile, China, on the other hand, experienced a historic heat wave that dried up the Jialing River, allowing people to now walk across the riverbed of a once gushing river. Earlier this year, India faced the highest temperatures on record for over a century, which affected its wheat yield and led to the subsequent imposition of an export ban. Ladies and gentlemen, the science is clear. Last year, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, highlighted that every region in the world was projected to witness stronger and longer heat waves, unprecedented droughts and floods, and accelerating sea level rise and storm surges. This same report assessed that Southeast Asia would be among the hardest hit regions. As such, for Southeast Asia, it is not a question of if, but when, how severe, and what we can and are doing about this. We must act now. We must show up our defenses while we still can. Climate change is a global challenge that requires both national action and a global response. It calls for participation and partnerships at all levels, particularly regional and international partnerships, and also among ASEAN countries. Singapore recognizes the importance of regional cooperation on climate action. Since 2018, we have partnered and supported fellow developing countries in the region to enhance climate action and implement their Paris Agreement commitments through the Climate Action Package, or CAP, which is under the Singapore Cooperation Program. Under this program, we have trained more than 137,000 officials from over 180 countries and territories in topics such as climate adaptation, mitigation, disaster risk management, and green finance. Later this month, we will be collaborating with ISEAS to organize a workshop for officials from ASEAN member states on decarbonization pathways. Equipped with the right skills and knowledge, we hope that officials can help lead the country's sustainable and climate resilient development. Singapore also hosts the ASEAN Specialized Meteorological Center, or ASMC for short, which builds regional capacity and provides important meteorological services. It also strengthens the region's resilience to climate change through monitoring and early warning of developments such as transboundary smoke haze from land and forest fires in the region. Between 2018 and 2022, we have committed 5 million Singapore dollars to the ASMC to build up its capabilities in weather and climate forecasts. Beyond our shores, Singapore is working to establish risk transfer tools to strengthen the financial and societal resilience of vulnerable communities and countries in our region in times of crisis. The Southeast Asia Disaster Risk Insurance Facility, or CDRIF, was established with the support of Japan and the World Bank to provide ex-ante climate and disaster risk financing solutions for Southeast Asian countries. CDRIF launched its first product in February 2021, which was a sovereign flood insurance solution that provides cover against flood risks in Laos. CDRIF is in the midst of conceptualizing its second product, which is a public asset financial protection program that allows CDRIF member countries in the region to better manage the financial risks from damage to public assets and infrastructure. Singapore is also affirming and strengthening our partnerships with other ASEAN countries. In March this year, we signed a Memorandum of Understanding with Indonesia on bilateral cooperation in climate change and sustainability. Last month, we concluded a revised MOU with Brunei on bilateral cooperation in environmental affairs and climate change. And we also have frameworks of cooperation with Malaysia, in digital and green economies. These partnerships enable our countries to collaborate on win-win opportunities that support both climate and economic objectives. Singapore will continue to seek further collaborations with others in ASEAN so that we can decarbonize and better weather the impacts of climate change together. Climate change will drastically change the way we live and operate. While urgent decarbonization is needed, we must also recognize that the transition to net zero will affect the livelihoods of many. Domestically, we must also partner our people, communities, and businesses to manage this transition. Last year, Singapore launched the Singapore Green Plan 2030 to mobilize and empower the public, private, and people sectors to co-create and co-implement solutions for sustainability as part of a continuous national engagement process. The Green Plan sets out a whole-of-nation sustainability roadmap to advance towards a low-carbon future through ambitious and concrete sectorial targets. It has 5 pillars: city in nature, energy reset, sustainable development, green economy, and a resilient future. Singapore is working hard towards these targets. For example, under the energy reset pillar, we developed one of the world's largest inland floating solar farms on a reservoir last year. We also aim to build 60,000 electric vehicle charging points in Singapore by 2030, and this is to encourage EV adoption. To address the threat of rising sea levels, we are developing plans and options to protect our coastline, combining engineering solutions with nature-based elements such as the planting of mangroves and sea grasses. This year, we are taking it one step further with the Forward Singapore exercise to engage a wide spectrum of Singaporeans in order to reach consensus on our social compact, including the roles and responsibilities of various segments of society in stewarding environmental sustainability. I thank ISEAS for your work on the Southeast Asia Climate Outlook Survey report. I look forward to studying the latest report, and I'm sure it will provide useful insights to policymakers, business leaders, community leaders, and the people of Southeast Asia in our collective push towards a more sustainable, inclusive, and climate resilient future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Low. Before I hand the time over to our moderator, may I invite all speakers to turn on their cameras for brief photo taking, and then we'll take a little time to allow our team to take a quick photo. Maybe I'll count you in. 3, 2, 1, smile. Okay, thank you very much. I would now like to introduce Ms Sharon Seah, Senior Fellow and Coordinator of the Climate Change in Southeast Asia Program, who will be taking us through the discussion. Sharon, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Jia Hui. Very good afternoon to our audience in the region, and a good morning to those who are coming in from Europe. My name is Sharon. I'm the coordinator of the program. I warmly welcome you to this afternoon's session on the launch of the Southeast Asia Climate Outlook 2022. We have conducted the survey since 2020 during the COVID-19 pandemic. This is our 3rd annual survey, and I'm happy to report that once again, we have learned so much about the attitudes and perceptions of people who are vested in the fate and future of this region. Not to toot our own horn, but we have searched high and low, and we've not found any other climate survey of the region, so we believe that we might be the only one out there. If you have come across another survey, please drop us an email and let us know. Before I begin the presentation, let me introduce our 3 discussants: Dr. Helena Varkkey from the University of Malaya, Dr. Indra Overland from NUPI, and Ms Johanna Son, who will provide their comments and insights into the findings of this year's survey. First, Dr. Helena Varkkey. She's Associate Professor at the Department of International and Strategic Studies at UM. Her research has been on the political economy of palm oil in Southeast Asia and the governance of transboundary haze pollution. She's very well clued in to the environmental issues and challenges in Malaysia and has been an advocate of how economic development can be reconciled with environmental sustainability. Our second discussant is Dr. Indra Overland, who is Research Professor at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. He is familiar with Southeast Asia, having worked on this area since 1992, and he has published extensively on energy and climate issues and has been widely cited in international media. Our third speaker, our third discussant is Ms Johanna Son, who is founder of Reporting ASEAN, an independent media platform that was started in 2014 to track and analyze news in ASEAN. It is independent of ASEAN and of any ASEAN entities, and she has been reporting on Southeast Asia for the last 3 decades. I would say that Johanna delivers a service for public good with reporting ASEAN. I personally have found the data visualizations on COVID-19 in her platform extremely useful and informative for our work. So with the introductions done, I will now begin the presentation. So here we go. Can I have the next slide? Yes. This survey, as we mentioned earlier, was taken in the middle of June this year, and it's meant to be a barometer of the attitudes and perceptions of Southeast Asians. And we've actually divided it into 5 sections. Actually, it's the slide before. Yes. So we've got 5 sections, including a profile section, and we polled people on the climate change issues, policies and actions, energy transitions, food security, and international climate cooperation. Now, the survey is really not meant to be completely representative. It presents only a general view of climate attitudes. So depending on the period that the survey is taken, certain concerns may become top of mind, as the respondents themselves are also influenced and shaped by, for example, media reporting on certain climate events. And you will see that evident in some of that results. Next slide, please. In terms of methodology, we conducted the survey online for over a period of 5 weeks, from the 8th of June to 12th of July. There were 38 questions in total. It sounds like a lot, but I assure you it's not, because some of it are actually branch-off questions, and about 7 were profiling questions. Respondents took about 12.5 minutes to take the survey in total. We had 1,386 self-identified Southeast Asian respondents from all 10 ASEAN member states complete the survey. Of this number, 425 were polled via what we call CAPI methods, computer-assisted personal interviews, in 4 countries: Brunei, Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar. We took the extra effort this year to offer the survey not only in English, but in 6 other languages: Bahasa Indonesia, Burmese, Laos, Khmer, Thai, and Vietnamese. Next. Next. Yes, so in terms of the coverage, we went to 10 ASEAN countries. Here, East Timor is not included as it is not part of ASEAN yet. When that status change, I believe we will cover East Timor in time to come. We added 2 new profile points this year. The first is the type of city, and the second would be the socio-economic status of the participants. So in terms of nationality, the Philippines led with the highest number of respondents, followed closely by Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia. And for this year, we asked majority of our respondents actually tell us that they currently reside in Southeast Asia, and there's a small minority who do not reside in this region, but are actually allowed to take the survey because we felt it was important to also be inclusive of people who are outside the region. Now, majority of them live in metropolitan cities, and here we classify the cities according to resident population size. So if you were in a city of more than 1 million, you would be considered a metropolitan city. Mid-sized cities are from 250,000 upwards, and towns have population sizes of less than 250,000. And for people who say they do not reside in cities, we classify them as rural respondents. We also had a good spread of age groups, with the biggest age group coming from the 21 to 35-year-olds. Next. In terms of gender, the split is quite similar to last year, where we have more females than males, and we also have a small minority who classify themselves as others. Education, again, we have here ranging from doctoral degrees to those who have only primary education. Now, for the first time again, this year, we actually asked people to rank themselves so based on this concept of a subjective social status, they were to self-identify their socio-economic status on a scale of 0 to 10. So on average, Southeast Asians don't feel too badly off. They stand at 6.1. Only Myanmar is an outlier where they feel that they are the worst off of the lot. Again, not surprising because of what's happening in the country due to the political and humanitarian crisis that they are facing. And next. Affiliation, we've kept to the same affiliation groups, 7 affiliation groups from business, finance and industry to students, retirees, academic think tanks, government, CSOs, media, and the last group will be regional, what we call international civil servants. Next. Okay, I will move right into the presentation itself. As with last year, we polled our respondents on where they got their top climate news sources from. So over a third tell us that they rely mainly on mainstream news sources. Another 20% say they rely on social media and online influencers or public figures. Now in Cambodia and Myanmar, we noticed that the large proportions of respondents actually rely on the social media and messaging app channels respectively. You see that word cloud on the right-hand side. Actually, this is a word cloud that came from an open-ended question that we asked the respondents, in which they were to name the channel, the messaging app channel, or the media outlet that they rely on. So you see, actually, Facebook is a very popular media platform that people rely on, and followed by WhatsApp. Across the region, it seems that people do use WhatsApp quite a lot, and you see various names even in their native language, where I believe they are naming the newspapers' names. Next. Okay, as with last year, we again find that climate concerns across the region is elevated. Over 90% are deeply concerned about climate change, with the Philippines showing the greatest urgency at 64.3%. And the levels of concern we notice actually generally increase with levels of educational attainment. So you see the people who are holding doctoral degrees express even a greater urgency to the issue. And those who say that climate change has no scientific basis, they tend to rely on conversations with friends and peers. I'm not able to show that data set on the slide because of space, but you will find this in our report. Next. Unfortunately, majority of the respondents who mentioned that they are very concerned about climate change. Actually, they just participate passively in this question we ask about the level of climate advocacy that they share. Most of them mainly follow news and share information, and that's at 64.8%. The Cambodians tend to be a little bit more active in climate advocacy by leading or joining climate projects. And in terms of people living in the people who are living in the two opposite spectrums of the types of cities, meaning if you live in a metropolitan city or you were in a rural area, you tend to be a little bit more proactive than the guys in the middle. Okay, next. We asked a question on what were their perceptions of negative climate impacts in about 10 years' time. And here on a scale of between 0 to 10, we have Southeast Asians ranking at 7.2, which means they expect that in some form or another, they will be personally impacted by negative climate or extreme weather events. So the Philippines, again, they expect the greatest negative impacts. And these elevated concerns are also recorded with persons who are living in rural areas, where they mark an average of 8 on that scale of 0 to 10. Sorry, can we go back? the socioeconomic status of an individual actually makes a difference. The higher you are on the socioeconomic scale, you tend to feel a greater concern for negative impacts in that time frame that we've put out there. Next. Okay, I just want to stop here and open this section up for discussion with our panelists. I can't see you. Here you are. Is there anything that stood out for you when you saw these results?
Yeah. Can I share a few thoughts?
Yes, Johanna.
Yeah. Hi. Good afternoon to everybody. I think the portion about where people get their news struck me for a couple of reasons. I mean, one obviously is that I think it follows what we also see in other reports, which reflect that news engagement is shifting from what is called here mainstream media to other channels like messaging apps. And I think messaging apps is an option this year, but I think not in the last year's survey from what I saw. So that's a reflection of that as well. I think overall, if you look at, for example, the more general reports like the digital news report that Reuters, the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism does, the latest one also showed like their parallel observations, I guess, like that people are shifting, that online consumption is rising and consumption through social media rising, and print and TV are generally going down, the proportion of people who say they rely on that most. So I'm theorizing that what we see in this survey also reflects that kind of same behavioral shift. And even TikTok is being used now for news, they say. So perhaps that's something that's interesting to go into a bit of more nuance maybe later on. Because in some surveys, the portion of people using social media for news are even over 70, over 80%. So that's interesting, I think. Yeah. Thank you.
Can I add on a bit to that? In the same vein, I fully agree with Ms. Johanna's observations, and I was also very not entirely surprised by the fact that a lot of people are, getting their information from messaging apps. And this was actually a similar finding to a survey that I was involved in as well about haze and how they got information for haze in Malaysia. And what was standing out at that survey was that generally the older population, they would rely much more on messaging apps, and they get their information from their family and friends. So I feel that that there may be opportunities, but there may also be some challenges or some dangers here, especially when we talk about climate change. We still do have people who think that it's a hoax, and who think that it's not actually happening. So there might be a bit more of a risk of sort of the wrong or not entirely accurate information being spread throughout these kind of mediums. So I think what is important here is that we do have to think as well about digital education and sort of teaching people, the older people, the youth, to be more aware and more careful about what they receive and what they consume in social media. And I think this will also go hand in hand with making sure the right kind of information are being communicated as well. Thank you.
Thanks. Yes, I agree that the medium of using apps and channels could lead to misinformation and disinformation. I see Indra has his hand up.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for inviting me to participate in this event. And I thought I'd follow up on these remarks about the information and communication side of things, which I think is one of the most important aspects of climate policy and climate politics. And I agree with Helena and Johanna that the social media is growing in importance, and especially for reaching young people. And I think it indicates that it's very important to reach out to people and to provide people good information through social media. And the trend globally, which I think also applies in Southeast Asia, is that increasingly the people who watch large-scale, often government-controlled or controlled by large corporations, linear media, linear television, and so on, are older people. So in a sense, to influence the future, you need to talk through social media. But the other side of that is that those older people have more power. So in a lot of countries around the world, you see a lot of young people getting a lot of information through social media, but not being able to influence politics so much. Whereas the larger mainstream media do have a big influence, and we see they are still the largest source of information in Southeast Asia. So it's important to look in both directions, and it's important also for the bigger actors controlling the large media to see their responsibility to provide good information through those media.
That's right. Can't agree more, actually. I think that the people who tend to, rely on channels, for instance, in this survey, we found that people from Myanmar tended to rely a lot on messaging app channels, possibly because they were also getting blocked from certain sites and they don't have complete access. So messaging channels which goes across between the diaspora Burmese who are living overseas and those who are living in Myanmar, that's how they've been sharing information and so on. So yeah, I agree, we need to look at both sides. And in one part of this survey, we also found that the older people tend to have more favorable views towards government policies. So again, this is borne out in the comments that Indra's made. Let's go back to the presentation and we can investigate a little bit more into the perceptions of policies and actions. Yeah, next, please. So every year we ask this question, who should be responsible for climate change? And every year we seem to be getting the same answers, which is people point to national governments, businesses, and industries. And then the last group will be the individuals, would be considered as the top three groups responsible for this. And subnational governments are also seen, surprisingly, as crucial in Cambodia and in Myanmar. What really surprised us this year was that people from rural areas tend to take greater individual responsibility than those who are living in the bigger cities. This could largely be due to the fact that maybe they see how their own personal actions may have led to some of those impacts. Next. And of course, with responsibility, there's always a cost question. We ask this every year, who should bear the cost of taking climate measures? Again, people think that national governments, businesses, and industries are the top two, and they should be playing their part. Subnational governments also come into the picture for Cambodians and Myanmar's. Individuals are seen as least responsible. Again, I think this is the fear of having to accept that cost and bearing that burden coming from the individuals. Moving on. We thought that this year it'd be very interesting to ask respondents about what they thought of their country's net zero targets. So we had a question where we asked them whether their country had a net zero target, just as a test to see if the kind of communication strategies that governments have been putting out were working. There's a great deal of uncertainty over whether their country had a net zero target. So majority of them, 61.3%, were unsure whether the country had net zero target. Only Vietnam, Singapore, and Cambodia had the highest proportion of people who answered correctly. And about 13.5% of Filipinos incorrectly believe that they have a net zero target. After they were asked this question, we showed them that little chart at the bottom, which was info that's accurate as of June this year, where we told them that 8 of these countries had some form of a net zero or carbon neutrality target that had been announced either in policy documents or by way of a political pledge. But we note that, of course, as recent as this week, Thailand is revising its target, and Singapore is also planning or has started a public consultation exercise to determine the year in which it will be net zero. So after they were told this information, moving on, we then asked them whether it was ambitious enough. Can I have the next slide? Yes, so we tried to assess what they thought of the level of ambition in their country's net zero target. So majority of Vietnam respondents actually think the net zero target is ambitious enough, and about 39.7 or almost 40% of Thai respondents are not satisfied with their target. And when the Philippines and Myanmar were told that their countries did not actually have a net zero target, 72.5% of Philippines respondents want one. But about 47% of Myanmar respondents remained unsure if they wanted one. I think this could be understandable given their current political and humanitarian crisis situation that they're facing. Perhaps don't have that mind space to be thinking about climate change and net zero targets and how ambitious these could be. So moving on. Here we asked people to assess government performance in addressing climate change. And only about 18% of respondents feel that the government considers it urgent and has allocated sufficient resources to address the issue. But thankfully, over half of Singaporeans hold this view. It could perhaps be due also to the government's very proactive stance in communicating their climate commitments to the people, and that comes in various forms. For instance, the Prime Minister makes it part of his National Day rally and so on. And the Singapore Parliament has also declared climate to be an existential threat and a crisis. All that gets communicated through the media to the people. There were higher levels of skepticism, though, seen in Thailand, Malaysia, and Laos respondents. And here we noticed that respondents who are over the age of 60 tended to have a better view of their government's policies and actions at 33.8%, but only 10% of the Gen Z, meaning the millennials, agree with this view. Moving on. This year, we thought that it would be interesting to see whether political parties within Southeast Asia had been doing a little bit more work with climate change. So we asked them, in a statement, my country's political parties do not prioritize climate change. Do you agree? Here, we have 49.3% expressing agreement with that statement. And Malaysia, Thailand, and Indonesia respondents are more likely to believe that their country's political parties do not prioritize the issue. Political parties, surprisingly, are seen as more active in climate change by Singapore respondents at 52%. And I don't have the space to show the data set here, but the higher the educational attainment, the greater the skepticism towards political parties prioritizing climate change, as seen in our results. Moving on. Okay, big word, decarbonization. We actually had a bit of trouble trying to translate this word into the native languages, and even explaining it was also difficult. So the question was to pick the three biggest obstacles to decarbonization in their country, and we offered 7 options. So overall, the top 3 were identified as insufficient financial resources, the lack of R&D, technology and expertise, and insufficient alternative energy resources across ASEAN. But for Malaysia, the top concern was the absence of political will. Again, we're not sure if this is kind of like a spillover effect of the kind of political changes that Malaysia has been witnessing in the last 3 or 4 years. And then for Indonesia, the top concern is the lack of public support. Yeah. There were also divergent opinions across affiliations. So the people who were affiliated with academia, think tanks, and research institutes were more likely to attribute challenges to an absence of political will, whereas those from the media were more likely to attribute it to a lack of public support. So depending on the background that you come from, you have quite different views about how you can overcome these challenges. And moving on. since the discussions around carbon pricing instruments has been gaining momentum in the region, we thought it'd be interesting to assess whether respondents in the region would be accepting of a carbon tax. Now, the idea of a carbon tax is still relatively new and nascent in the region. I don't think it has been properly explained, actually. But so when people see the word tax, they might get a little alarmed. But to our surprise, actually, there is moderate acceptance of a carbon tax, but the levels vary by country. So the highest acceptance is found in the Philippines, Cambodia, and Thailand, and the lowest acceptance rates are in Myanmar, again, not surprising, Brunei and Laos. And we also found that respondents at the lower end of the socio-economic hierarchy were more likely to reject a carbon tax. Understandably, perhaps the fear is that it would unnecessarily burden them and cause their livelihoods to be in danger. And then the second point that we found was that the higher the level of education, the greater the acceptance of a carbon tax. Yeah, so we'll stop here for a bit of discussion on those key points that were put up. Any reactions from you?
May I go first?
Yes, Helena.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, so Malaysia, where I'm from, came up quite a bit in this section of the survey, and I thought that was really interesting. And what you kind of indicated, it's kind of a reflection on what has happened in the past few years in our country, the political instability, the sort of political games that have been happening. I think is really making people in Malaysia quite maybe we can say a bit skeptical and a bit fed up of the government's seriousness in actually governing things properly rather than sort of just like power politicking. So that's, I think, definitely has affected Malaysians' confidence in the government in general. But I think one more thing that we can consider is also the clarity in communication. So I feel that, I don't know the other countries very well, but I feel that for Malaysia at least, there is some space for improvement in this. So, for example, some of the terms that Malaysian policymakers tend to use, it's a bit unclear. So, for example, our carbon neutrality targets is by 2050 at the earliest. So that's kind of a vague statement over there. And then things like, what do you call this, emission intensity for our NDCs. So these are kind of things, these are statements, or rather these are phrases that are not used by other ASEAN countries. They're quite unique to Malaysia. And I think what that means is that a lot of us cannot really understand and cannot really relate to what it actually means. So when Malaysians feel that I'm not really clear on what my country is trying to say or my government is trying to say, we kind of switch off and we kind of lose a bit of trust in what's going on. And again, if you don't mind just me mentioning again the survey that I did relating to haze as well, it really ties in nicely to the result that your survey found on the political parties. So for Malaysia as well, our respondents said that, haze was never a political issue, rather never an election issue. And I think this carries over very well, climate change until today, or rather now, despite the sort of persistence of the issue, does not seem to be carrying over into the voting space. So that's, I think, quite lacking in Malaysia. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Helena. Johanna, did you want to come in with a comment?
Yes, I kind of was curious about a few things, what they could mean or maybe what they could point to. But I think one is like, if you look at the responses to like who's responsible, individual responsibility, and even about the resources part, they seem to be like kind of, for lack of a better word, external. Like it's the government, it's the business. And if you look at individual responsibility being quite low, that's about 1 out of 5. And interestingly, the rural respondents had a little bit higher figure. So I mean, I wondered whether that was part of, I mean, it could be many things, obviously, which we can't tell now, but it could be also partly a perceptions thing. Several of you mentioned the issues around understanding, messaging, and what some of the terms really mean. And I think I feel quite a kinship with that idea, which is also why we did like sustainability, which had a lot of climate stuff inside, kind of like a tool for journalists to understand, because I think there's a whole debate around, many of these things as well. So perhaps it's also that. I think though that especially when we go to the next section, I think we're going to see quite a bit of things that will probably, to me, showing up as advocacy points, both as education, decision-making, even maybe campaigning and lobbying. So I think, I was curious about the externalization aspect of or is it probably that people feel it's not something they can really do something about, or they probably see a limitation in, we always like to say, I always, in some stories, I say, we connect the personal to the planetary, right? But maybe that's not always very concrete. And maybe there's a sense of information is part of the empowerment part, perhaps. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
So if I could butt in, what strikes me about this part, or one point that struck me from this part of the presentation, is that there's quite an even. The respondents seem to see various reasons as more or less equally important for lack of progress on climate change, but finance is the one they blame most. And I would think that, and actually I think it was in third or fourth place was political will. And I would actually personally think that the main challenge is personal will. And that of course makes sense because I work in a research institute, and your research institute think tank respondents thought the same thing as me. So I'm kind of true to form, true to where I stand. That's how it looks like to me, both in Southeast Asia and also in other parts of the world, but maybe especially in Southeast Asia. There's maybe a little lack of, or there aren't as many politicians who are kind of profiling themselves on environmental protection. And it's also interesting that I think you mentioned that the respondents in the media think that lack of public support is the main reason, which doesn't fit with your other feedback from your respondents, that actually many of the respondents care about this. Of course, it's not a representative survey, so we're not sure. But I recently saw some research from the US, which showed that people generally think that the level of climate skepticism is much higher than it is. So there's this kind of, even among people who are preoccupied with climate, there's an illusion of a public political resistance or problem here, which is in some ways enhanced by the media themselves. So I think this is a slightly perplexing problem and a paradoxical thing, but it's also a great opportunity. It shows that if you can just show people how many other people agree with them, that one needs to move forward, it might not be that difficult in terms of public opinion, which should then provide the basis for political will, because politicians are influenced by public opinion. And then this final, returning to my first point, I think lack of finance is really not a reason for inaction on climate change. There are so many things one can do which don't require money. So it's and especially in a lot of developing countries, it's become kind of a mantra, is that but we don't have enough money. Yeah. But actually a lot of, and I've been recently spending some time in cities which have done a lot to change, for example, their transport infrastructure, the streets, cycling lanes, and so on, and cities that haven't done anything. And I think the cities which have done a lot, you can see it's not costing them much financially, and it's actually generating a lot of very positive side effects for them. It's very comfortable to be in those cities, where the cities that haven't done much are paying an incredible price, including financially, in terms of traffic jams and pollution and inconvenient transport situation and so on. So I see that people think that finance is a big problem, and I don't agree.
I think also in this region, people tend to subscribe to the, common but differentiated responsibility concept, where they feel that, well, we haven't caused it and we haven't got that financial resources to go solve it. We need that assistance. And in some of the countries and NDCs, they do explicitly put conditional targets, condition on receiving assistance. And to be fair to them, yes, I suppose, having gone through the pandemic, they have other priorities as well. So they are spread quite thin, and they need as much help as possible. Did you want to come in on that, Indra?
Yeah, I'd love to comment on that. I mean, I think from a climate justice perspective, that is very true. I mean, the contrast between countries which have been industrialized a long time ago and which have emitted incredible amounts of pollution, and which also continue to do that today. For example, look at the rate of people flying long distance. The difference between somebody like me and somebody poor in a poor country is just huge differences, and there are very big issues there, which are really intractable and difficult to deal with, and are going to be around for a long time. We're going to be dealing with that, the climate justice issue, for a long time. However, I think that over-focusing on that climate justice issue can actually damage the interests of a lot of poor people in developing countries, because climate policy isn't just a burden, it's also an opportunity. And as I was saying about these cities which have changed the way people move around the city, it has huge side benefits. It's not a loss of money, it's a gain of money and a gain of welfare in many ways. And you don't actually need that much money, if you have a street and you've painted parking spots along one side of the street, to change that paint into cycle lane doesn't, hardly costs anything at the level of municipal expenses, but it has incredible benefits. So climate justice, yes, but one shouldn't lose sight of how a lot of climate-related policy can have very positive side benefits, and actually can be a win-win situation, not a burden. And the other side of that, and I mean, going further, it's not just this is in terms of local solutions and so on, but also industrially and in terms of economic growth. What's happening now is that some countries are moving forward, including, for example, China, and are developing incredible foothold on green technologies, which a lot of the poor countries, which say they can't do anything, realistically, they're going to be buying these technologies for the next 100 years. They're going to be paying money to use these technologies because a lot of these technologies are good and efficient and save you money. So it's not just a burden, it's also a race. It's an opportunity and it's in a race. Thank you. Thanks.
Helena, you have a comment?
Could I also just contribute to that? I want to say a few words about the CBDR, like you mentioned as well. I'm quite agreeable with Dr. Indra. There's quite a lot of opportunities, and it depends on how you think about it. So what I've written about this before, just because a country wants to maximize its opportunity to receive funding for climate, it doesn't actually mean that it doesn't mean that they cannot go all out at the national level or at their individual level to do what they can. So I think that like for example for Malaysia, Malaysia has removed its conditional on assistance from its NDCs, and I think this is great. And I think what message that sends is to the Malaysian people. We want to go all out and do whatever we can for the climate, but that does not mean that Malaysia is saying that we don't believe in CBDR, we're going to do everything just like any other developed country. So what Malaysia does at the international level, at the negotiation space, can still be very much pushing for, equal, returns and investment from the developing country, but from the developed countries. But at the national level, I believe that, this should not be the thing that is too emphasized. It should not be overemphasized, because then it will be like, okay, we can just sit back and not really be bothered because we're going to get help from the outside. And this also returns back to one of the questions that you asked about the individual action. So by sort of having this sort of two-level strategy, going a bit differently at the international level, but locally a more personal level, I think can be helpful. So we still maintain the CBDR, but at the same time, empowering and educating the local citizens to get on board with the program along with the government as well.
Great. Thanks for your interventions. I think this is a very robust conversation we're having. Mindful of time, I'm going to go into the next section where there'll be more to discuss. Can I have the slides up, please? So prompted very much by the discussions, next slide, at COP26 last year, we asked respondents, there was a statement, ASEAN countries should stop building new coal power plants immediately. Do you agree? And here we have a majority of Southeast Asians who say that we should immediately cease new coal power plants at 62.4%. And the sentiment is strongest in Cambodia, Malaysia, and the Philippines. But of course, the group of respondents that are in disagreement are actually from Myanmar and Vietnam. Myanmar, you see on the chart that they are most unsure about this issue. We also see that the youngest and the oldest groups of respondents express the strongest support for scrapping plans. So it shows that actually the issue is important for both the young adults and the older persons. There's a large share of people from between 21 to 35 years old who are unsure about the issue. And then the next question we asked, what was their preferred deadline for coal consumption phase out? Can we move to the next slide? And here we have a third who say that they support an immediate phase out of coal consumption in their country. Another third support a phase out by 2030. And the support is actually strongest in Cambodia, Indonesia, and Thailand. So going back to that discussion earlier about the economic benefits of tackling climate issues and of finding opportunities for new investments and so on, we did ask a question, but I have not highlighted in the deck of slides, is that the reduction on dependence of fossil fuels will actually be painful in the short term, but could be beneficial in the long term. And there's a great deal of consensus on that point. Okay, moving on to the next slide. We wanted to know which sources of clean energy had the most potential or were viewed as having the most potential in the respondents' countries, and they were asked to choose two choices. So here, there's a diversity of views, but in general, we see that solar, hydropower, and wind energy are perceived as top sources in most countries. And hydropower is more preferred amongst respondents in mid-sized cities and in the rural areas. And the preference for wind actually comes from wind power. So actually the background you see that we're using is a picture that is of Vietnam's wind mills in Vietnam and amongst the paddy fields. And the biggest support for green hydrogen is from Myanmar. Now, what's really interesting is that nuclear energy has received the highest support from Singapore respondents. But nuclear, when you go down to look at where the types of cities that people live in, is not an option for rural respondents, presumably because they think that nuclear power plants could be sited in the rural areas and they may be concerned about nuclear safety. Okay, so moving on. We were curious as well about the food security, food insecurity issues that has been coming up ever since the Russia-Ukraine war and the disruptions to food supply chains. So here we have about over 31% of Southeast Asians feel that their food supply is threatened, mainly by extreme weather events. And then the second group at about 25% say that it's actually global supply chain disruptions. This is followed by a kind of look at, they feel that reduced food exports from producing countries have contributed to that problem. whereas degraded farmlands and labor shortages form the smallest groups, smallest reasons. So threat perceptions actually vary across the region. In Vietnam and Myanmar, extreme weather events were seen as very consequential for food supplies, whereas the respondents from Singapore and Brunei, which do not have significant agricultural sectors, they put more emphasis on global supply chains and facing the reduction on food exports, and that's impacted them. Degraded farmlands, on the other hand, were the greatest source of threat in Indonesia. And Malaysians tend to give higher importance to labor shortages as compared to the rest of the region. Now, the type of city that respondents live in also influences the way they perceive threats to food supplies. So respondents in rural areas, not surprisingly, are most concerned about extreme weather events. And this resonates with the FAO's 2022 report as well. Now, people who live in cities, metropolitan areas, mid-sized cities and towns, they give importance as well, but they are equally as worried about global supply chain disruptions and reduced food exports. And then moving on into the next follow-up question. We asked them what should be your government's top priority in addressing the crisis on food insecurity. And over half of respondents are in favor of strengthening domestic food production. And this priority is greatest in the Philippines, Brunei, and Indonesia. Advancing food and nutrition technology is the second most popular priority, particularly in Cambodia and Myanmar. Banning food exports, of course, received the least support across all countries. And this one. Okay, and then we move into a discussion at this point. Did anything strike you out of the energy space, out of the food space?
May I?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So I really like the questions about coal, and I thought that was very important to ask. But I think, you did mention that maybe we can also offer some suggestions on what we would have liked to see as well. So I thought it was interesting that you highlighted things like hydropower, solar, wind energy. Of course, solar is very popular and I think quite feasible. But there's a lot of conversations going on now about whether hydropower is actually that green or that clean. So I think an interesting question that would have been good to ask was also the public's perception of how clean each of these other options are. So even things like nuclear, things like gas, these are also some sort of gray area kind of energy sources. So it'll be interesting to gauge how the region actually views these kind of things. And it's very important as well to see when you move away from coal, what actually comes to replace it. So every country has a slightly different strategy. So yeah, that kind of information would have, I would have liked to see a lot more, some more on that to give a bit more color to this understanding about how we will move away from coal in the region. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah. Can I add a few things?
Yes.
Yeah, about coal, I was thinking that I guess if you look at the energy picture, it's kind of, in a way, the entry-level issue. I think it's generally known that we should be moving away from coal kind of thing. But probably the debate, if you draw a bit from the responses, also shows that in the region, we are kind of earlier on in the story, in the sense that some parts of the West, they've already done it, right? Or already put deadlines and stuff. So I think that I echo the interest about like what the alternatives could be, and what also perhaps as a signal to maybe political leaderships as to like what people find, okay, or might be willing to pay for. I think it was interesting that hydropower was still rather high in the response list. And about food security, I think that's another like good entry point into the larger discussion. In the sense that I think sometimes when you say climate change, or even climate emergencies, like this big chunk that you could look at it in many ways, or you could be anxious about it in many ways, I guess. But I mean, if specific questions about how this will change your life, for example, such as food, right? I think help bring the issue down further to what does it mean for the way I live? Because I think is the bigger question really is like, how does it change life as we have known it or as we have chosen to live it, right? So, I think also that as we move ahead, I think increasingly even in news, we're seeing that it's the intersection among these different issues that somehow are related to something that's happening out there in the climate that is becoming quite necessary and important and probably vital as well to national, regional, or global discussions about climate change. So yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I think in many ways, the connection between the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere leading to the extreme weather impacts that you might be experiencing has not really been well understood by the general public, because it's like drawing that line between two very, very distinct and very different. Your experience doesn't relate back to how this is actually caused, so that the kind of explanation we need to go down a little deeper into that. But we also thought that this year, with the Ukraine crisis happening in February, there were these ebbs and flows and discussions about coal consumption. And we thought that countries would be quite concerned in this region as well. And we were actually surprised that there was still strong support for phasing out coal, because clearly the kind of energy security issues, actually even prior to Ukraine, as of late last year, there was already a global energy crunch. And we thought that would be really impactful. And surprise, still a lot of support. The question is, of course, where would your alternative sources come from? I think Indra would be the best place to comment.
Yeah, I wasn't actually going to say anything about Ukraine. I was going to comment on another aspect of your findings on coal, which struck me. Well, first of all, I think coal is really the key challenge in ASEAN when it comes to climate mitigation. And I think in some countries, it's a really tricky issue, especially in Indonesia, because you have a very large population, you have a growing economy, and you have a lot of domestic coal resources. So stopping using those coal resources is very difficult. And you don't have a lot of space for solar panels, and you don't have a lot of wind resources, at least not onshore is not particularly attractive. So what struck me about your findings is that the similarity between the Indonesian case, which is very difficult, and the Filipino case. So the Philippines is a major net importer of coal. So not a very rich country, which is giving away its money to other countries to import coal, when, for example, distributed solar power would probably be cheaper if you have the right facilitating policies, regulatory policies. So I thought that was a really interesting thing to see. Okay, in Indonesia, not so much support for stopping coal yet, but understandable. But also in Philippines, very paradoxical.
True, deserves a deeper look. I wish I had the resources to go out there and do focus group discussions with our respondents, and we can understand a lot better about the way they think. Shall we move on? We have just a last section, and then we'll move on to taking questions from the audience. So the last section is on perceptions of international climate cooperation. And we asked respondents about what they thought about their country's role in international climate action. So the question was, which statement best reflects your views about your country's role? And we gave 5 options. My country contributes to climate change and needs to step up. My country feels the impact, but major emitters must be responsible. My country didn't cause it, but needs to play a more active role because it concerns our future. We didn't cause it, but to help to decarbonize, we need international assistance. And the last one, we didn't cause it, and we shouldn't have to demonstrate climate action in international fora. So almost half of respondents feel that their countries caused climate change and should contribute to global climate efforts. Cambodia and Laos respondents believe that they should contribute despite not causing it. So here we have the largest proportion that believe countries did contribute and need to step up efforts is actually most pronounced in the Philippines. Again, majority of Philippines respondents are found to be most consistent in articulating that sense of urgency towards climate change. Yeah. And then moving to the next one, we asked this question about who they thought within ASEAN had the potential to be the regional climate leader. And about 53% of the region believe that Singapore has that potential to be the leader, followed by Indonesia at 11.1%. And there's a small group of skeptics, about 8.8%, who say that they would rather not choose any of the above than to cast a vote for a country. So Singapore actually is the top choice for every country except Indonesia. 52% or nearly 53% of Indonesians would rather choose their own country. And we have surprisingly actually 81.8% who chose Singapore, the highest amongst the 10 countries. Yeah. And moving on to the next slide, we asked this question last year as well about who might be a potential global climate leader, seeing that that space has been left unfilled. There's been a lot of, discussion, talk about, the absence of climate leadership in the world. So we asked, in your opinion, who has demonstrated climate leadership to help the world achieve Paris-aligned goals? The EU, again, is the most popular middle power overall. They are thought to have demonstrated global leadership at 21.9%, although there's a dip from 30.7% the year before. We believe this dip might be because the US ate EU's lunch. Ever since the US came back to the Paris Agreement, its ratings actually improved from the last survey. So from 4.8 to 20.7%, about a five-fold increase. And Japan within the region is viewed as the third strongest leader by all the respondents. So notably, the EU is actually the top choice amongst people of higher educational attainment, whereas the US is rated more favorably by people with primary and secondary school level education. And then the last question we had was a follow-up question to this slide on who might be their preferred climate cooperation partner. Surprise, surprise, it's not the EU, it's actually Japan. Japan is most popular when it comes to its potential for cooperation with ASEAN countries. And the US is the most preferred for Cambodia, whereas China is more popular among the Laos and Myanmar respondents. Yeah, so we found that across affiliations, the government and civil society respondents are more likely to choose Japan, whereas those in academia tend to favor the EU. And that actually concludes what I want to present. There are many more questions in the survey, of course, and we haven't got time to go over all of it. But I want to just pause here on any reactions to the set of leadership questions, whether regionally or globally. Indra.
Unmute myself. So for me, it's really surprising that, so EU's in the first place, but the US has, as in terms of being seen as an international climate leader, but the US is almost neck and neck. It's just behind the EU. And then comes Japan. And I find that really surprising because my understanding is that the EU is clearly the global leader on climate change, and the US has played quite sometimes it's played a very positive role, but a lot of the time, we just had a full presidency with Donald Trump, who's a a climate skeptic and definitely an obstructionist. And also, I mean, just in general, even now with Democrats supposedly pro-climate in power, it's very difficult for them to do anything. So that the US should be almost as good as the EU is very strange for me. And also that the Japan comes in the third place is also very strange, because Japan in the 1990s played a positive role when the Kyoto Protocol was written and so on. But in the last 20 years, Japan has had a key role in undermining international climate action and attacking and undermining other countries which are trying to do something. So Japan has played a very negative role, which is also very paradoxical, because Japan is a major importer of fossil fuels and has very large potential wind resources, for example, which it could develop, but which it has failed to develop, and is seen, according to your survey, as a desired climate partner. So if Japan seizes those opportunities, there are incredible opportunities for Japan at many levels. But how it could be perceived as like the third leader is very difficult for me to understand. Ahead of, for example, the UK, which, like the EU, has taken on, has made incredible progress on climate mitigation.
Maybe I can jump in here. I think proximity is a friend. Japan being right here in Asia and being very near to us, maybe viewed through that kind of proximity lens. And it's also been a partner of ASEAN for the last coming to 55 years. And Japan's ODA record to the region has been just astounding. And there have been many beneficiaries, right, of Japan's ODA assistance. Maybe not so much in the climate area because this is really new, but at least in the early decades, all the infrastructure building, the bridges, the roads, railways, they were
coal power
built
plants,
with some form or another from Japanese assistance. So I would say perhaps this is kind of a residual, after having seen that kind of track record, respondents may be hopeful that Japan would take on a more proactive role in helping them tackle the climate issues. Yeah, although I don't know, at the international climate negotiations level, I don't think many respondents would be clued in to the kind of obstructionist views that may have come out of there. Yeah.
Yeah, Sharon, I really agree with you in terms of Japan's positioning in the region. And I think looking at other countries that has also come in here, like the US and China, I think in the region, there's a lot of balancing going on, like US and China are seen to be at opposite ends of the spectrum, who want to sort of gain some power, some standing in this region. So compared to US and China and compare that with Japan, I think perhaps some of the respondents or many of the respondents thought that Japan was more of a benevolent kind of a power that doesn't really has much ulterior motives. And even compared to EU as well, because even though EU definitely has been sort of a climate leader, but if you see how the EU has engaged in the region on issues related to climate, so like for example with palm oil, it's been a bit of a tension there, because yes, they are trying to push for better supply chains and all that, but that has been perceived to be negative for palm oil markets and the producers in the region. So perhaps taken all together, Japan would be the least problematic among all. And if I can just take a few more seconds to mention about Singapore as perceived as the sort of climate leader in the region. I don't find that surprising, but I do find that a bit, it's not surprising because logically, I think Singapore has shown leadership, but leadership in what sense? If the other countries in the region are looking to someone for an example of how to do it, I think Singapore might not necessarily be the best example because Singapore is very unique. It's a small, it has a very different economic profile. So if looking for examples, I feel that, Singapore may not be able to offer much examples to the rest of the region compared to other countries. So that's all from me. Thank you.
Can I interject one thing, Sharon? Yeah, I was just thinking that this set of questions comes to me as the part 2 of my original hypothesis around resource and finance, like infusing, I think, it's themselves into people's answers. Although the question was first leader and second partner in cooperation, right? But I think people tend to think of resources, and so it's sort of that came to me because I was thinking, so that's why Japan and that's why Singapore, when it comes to within ASEAN countries, not really saying that it's kind of the prospect of it, I guess. And in many ways, yeah, I mean, Japan still largely means ODA to many Southeast Asians. So I think it's still a lot of this weight that's being processed when this lens, when people process questions like that, perhaps.
I like the comment by Helena about Singapore. Actually, I would, I did think that perhaps the Indonesians who chose Indonesia had the thought that Singapore did not have, or in the sense that their own country had the strategic heft to be able to lead, although they may not have the best examples to show, how to do it. But if you look at it objectively, I think Singapore has been quite proactive in, for instance, in the Permanent Secretary's speech, he mentioned about how Singapore has been going around, has all these bilateral climate cooperation MOUs, which I believe would be a, kind of a first in the region, and trying to tie up with different countries to cooperate on climate issues. Singapore's also co-chaired the Article 6 ministerial consultations with Norway. And that in itself, Singapore has perhaps shown some form of willingness to play a more visible role on the international stage. So it'll be quite interesting also to really dig into, why the other countries even thought about Singapore. But surely, yes, the economic profile of Singapore, the very unique circumstances surrounding Singapore, and how all of its experience could be applicable or not to the other countries, I think needs further examination. Indra, any comments on leadership?
Not really beyond what I've said. I have a methodological question, or maybe input for the future, but I can maybe save that for another occasion.
Okay, we can take that offline.
Yeah.
I'm now just going to invite questions from our guests. We have a question here from the Straits Times, but I think the question that she's asked has actually been sort of answered in parts over the course of the discussion. The first one was whether the desire to stop coal consumption has declined compared to last year. Could it be due to the energy insecurity as a result of Ukraine-Russia conflict? Personally, I think so, but without being able to dig into more of that, talk to more of the respondents, I wouldn't really know. It's a guess that we can make that these sorts of fears have come about. But as I mentioned earlier, it comes in ebbs and flows, right? Because then there will be some newspapers that report on how affordable renewable energy has become, and how the EU is going to go in a big way to tap into RE and so on. And then the second question that Cheryl has is the reasons for why eliminating that support is weaker in Brunei, Indonesia, and Myanmar. I think a lot of it might be economic related reasons, particularly for Myanmar and Indonesia. Here's another cool question from Daryl from the Chinese newspaper Lianhe Zaobao in Singapore. Would like us to explain the correlation between two questions. Let's see. The report finds that 62.4% of respondents think that regional countries should immediately cease building new coal power plants. This is a new question, yes. Comparatively, there was a slight dip in the number of people who agree that ASEAN countries should cut their reliance on coal from 79% last year to 72.5%. So explain the correlation and whether the perception of using coal for electricity generation has changed in light of the world's energy crunch. Okay. My view is that there is no ASEAN house view on the use of coal. It actually depends on each country's decisions to include coal in its total primary energy supply. So there's no house view, but I do think that these sets of responses from the survey do show that in the short term, there might be some concern that cutting coal consumption without any viable alternative sources might hurt them. Hence, you saw that dip in cutting reliance. Whereas when they were asked about building new coal power plant, I think the understanding is that new build take time. And perhaps the understanding is also that instead of doing new build for coal, could we invest that the finances for that into other alternative energy sources? Yeah. I think, let me look. Would any of our commentators like to pick up the questions?
Sharon, somebody would like to ask a verbal question. Is that possible?
I don't think this setting allows for it. Please type in the question in the Q&A.
There is a question in the chat box.
Yes, I'm looking at it now. Okay, so the question is regarding Singapore's potential to be a climate leader. Is there a reason why such a large percentage of Cambodia supports Singapore? Very good question. It puzzled me too as I looked at the numbers. So essentially from the data, and I believe the report will actually be online already. If my colleague Jia could just share that link so that the rest of the audience can take a look at the report. From the report, Cambodians chose only 5 countries where they saw that there were they were potential leaders. And the 5 were Singapore, Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, and Cambodia itself. So it really restricted itself to just these 5 countries. And then surprisingly, over 81% went to Singapore in a vote. I can't hazard a guess. I don't know if any of the discussants may have an insight into how Cambodians think about leadership issues. Nope. Okay. So I think we've come to the end. We've actually crossed 2 minutes past 4:30. I want to thank everyone really for this very robust discussion. I love all of the comments that you've given. It's given us food for thought, of course, into thinking about, how we can better the survey, how we can dig a little deeper into the perceptions. And of course, we hope that the results will make their way to the policymakers that be and the practitioners, and to prompting them to think a little harder about what more they can do. And of course, for us as individuals, personally, at the level of consumption, at the level of usage, how we can change our behavior and how we can play our part for the environment. So with that, I want to bring this discussion to a close. I want to thank all our discussants. Thank you very much for your time and thank you for your thoughts. And I hope that you all get a chance to download a copy of the survey, which is now online. And the rest of our audience, please feel free to just email us your thoughts at climatechange@iseas.edu.sg. And hand this time back to the NC.
Thank you to Sharon and our distinguished panelists for the lively session. The survey report will be available for download on the ISEAS website, and you may click on the link in the chat box, which I've put there, to access the report. I would also like to thank the audience for your active participation this afternoon, and we have now come to the end of the survey launch. I hope you have enjoyed the discussion. Thank you and have a nice day, everyone.
Thank you.